Hello, listeners, and welcome back once more to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Thank you for joining me today. Have you ever heard of something called tall poppy syndrome? If not, great news. You're going to be learning a lot more about it today, as well as a number of other key leadership topics, such as recruitment processes and hiring the right person, and general leadership lessons that my guest has learned from a career that has spanned 20 years as a coach, plus some time in executive search companies before that. So my guest is Barbara Morris-Blake of Elevate Organizations. Barbara is an executive coach, and as CEO of Elevate Organizations, she specializes in training those who are in leadership positions in improving the team and workplace dynamics and advocating for women in the workplace. So we'll be covering all of these topics and more, and it's a very leadership-focused episode this week. So I hope you enjoy it. Plenty to learn today.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Barbara, thank you so much for joining me today from Austin, Texas. And it's quite early in the morning for you. So a double thank you for joining me at, what is it, 7:30 on a Monday morning?
It's 7:30 on a Monday morning, and It's a pleasure to be here with you, David.
Well, let me just say I admire the commitment getting up that early.
Well, it's a great podcast, so I'm happy to be part of it.
Awesome. Well, happy to have you here. And I'm going to hand the reins over to you very briefly to introduce yourself to the listeners, tell us a bit about what you do, your background, how you've ended up doing what you do, and what gets you out of bed in the morning.
Well, I'm Barbara Morris-Blake, and I've been dealing with people in sort of HR capacity for probably 25 years. I love what I do. I've been an executive coach for over 20 years. So I was one of the first executive coaches. I was the second cohort going through the school there that certified me. So that says a lot about my age, I think, too. But as soon as I heard about coaching, I thought, wow, there's a need in the marketplace for that. There's a need in organizations. So went and got certified as soon as I could. So that's been 2000. I graduated in 2003, so it's 20 years now, but I was coaching for many years before that. And I love working with people on an individual basis, and I love teamwork. That working with teams is just fascinating to me, how you bring a bunch of people together and expect magic to happen. And it doesn't always. And so, being able to come in and sort of transform a team is really great. I've just put together a leadership development course, which will be launched any day now. And that was a bit more of an undertaking than I expected, but I have to say I'm really pleased with the results. And I did that because I do a lot of one-on-one, and I work with a lot of overachievers. And I could see some commonalities, and I just decided to pull together all my experience and offer that in the marketplace.
Doing the coaching thing before it was trendy then.
Yes, exactly. So now it's a whole different thing, but luckily it's just been a wonderful experience for me and hopefully for my clients.
Yeah, I'm sure. And it's certainly exploded, hasn't it, as an online concept, I guess, in the last few years. But prior to that, what are the big shifts you've seen in coaching as an industry over the time you've been doing it?
Well, unfortunately, it's been a bit commoditized because there's just been so many people going into the market. I think it's like anything else. The more you do it, the better you become. You get to these experiences. It's hard to teach those experiences, right? So I'm sure there's other coaches out there that are excellent. But I think there are some coaches that really have come out of a training which gives you great framework, but doesn't really give you the experience of, really understanding sort of the unconscious behaviors or the barriers that can stand in the way of success for so many people. That comes from, just talking to lots and lots of people over years and hearing people's stories and this is one of the reasons I put together the leadership course, because I saw commonalities, about self-awareness and self-management. Before you get into how to give feedback, you really have to deal with the person as a whole first.
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes sense to me because I've done something very similar. I'm not going to disagree with you because I'll be disagreeing with myself. There we go. Yeah, so I mean, there's one particular phrase that I've spotted in a fair bit of what you've written about, and also in your profile as well, which I thought was interesting, so I had to ask you about it. Tall poppy syndrome. Now, I'm assuming this is not to do with the allergies that we were talking about before we started recording, and that it has something to do with leadership. So can you tell us a bit about that and how it affects women in particular in the workplace?
Yeah, so, it's been there forever, but now it's just been getting a lot of press. Actually, it was someone out of Canada who did research recently on the topic of tall poppy syndrome and was pretty blown away by the percentage of women that felt they had experienced tall poppy syndrome. So basically what it is when you're successful, talented or high achieving, that, you're being criticized or resented or sort of put down as a result of jealousy or insecurity on the person, or, what the desire to sort of keep the status quo. And it can affect men and women, but it certainly seems to be more prevalent in women's experience within the workplace.
Okay, interesting. And so can you maybe give us an example of the kind of thing that's involved, or what happens to people who experience it, I guess?
Well, the whole tall poppy syndrome, so the original out of Greek was this cutting down. It's a feeling like cutting down something that stands out, right? So, I mean, it's pretty demoralizing for someone who's doing well and experiencing success and feeling like they're adding value to their organization, and then there's someone in the organization that for some reason is jealous or just is not comfortable with that person standing out, and so that they can undermine them. They can criticize them. There's lots of things that can happen. One that's just popping into my head right now is a woman who really is expert in her community. She knows a lot about the unusual community that she's in, and someone that she worked with just totally ignored that and talked over her whenever she would bring her expertise in, and just that's the kind of thing that happens where someone, and that happened to be a woman to a woman, which is unusual, but it does happen for sure. Where it's just, here you're just not seen for all that you're bringing, or that someone's clearly trying to undermine your success within an organization.
It kind of makes me think of some of the less pleasant things you see in the culture of the internet, actually. Like if you're well known, you almost become a target for being cut down, I guess is the phrase, isn't it? Yeah, interesting. I can't say it's something I don't think I've experienced it anyway. I'm not sure I've witnessed it either, which maybe is a good thing. I don't know.
Well, I don't want to state the statistic wrong, but it was very high, like well in the 80s or even low 90s, that women responded to the questionnaire saying that they had experienced it. So it does tend to be more female experience, but men do. I've heard men that have had that experience too.
And why do you think it is more likely to be experienced by women than men? That's an obvious question.
I think women, are still, if we kind of look at just generally speaking, women are, their incomes are less. There's still sort of that gender bias, and we know that, right? We can't deny that. So I think it's just, it's easier. That could be a part of what happens with men and women. And if a woman's exceeding a male, it may be, it's not societal norms, and that could maybe prompt it too. Or, I mean, who knows what this could be about? I mean, it could be, the way a man is raised as opposed to the way a woman's raised. Who knows? It's a very complex. The underpinnings are very complex, I think. But the bottom line is that women are experiencing it, and it's affecting them. There's no question about it. It's affecting them. I mean, when I saw the first survey, I was shocked. I mean, I hear women in my experience talking about someone trying to undermine them, and I mean, I've coached around that for years, but I didn't realize how extensive this was and the impact that it has on women and in organizations and the bottom line.
Do you think it's all part of the same kind of problem, why we see fewer women in leadership roles at senior levels of companies, and why there's kind of this differential, isn't there, between mindset even, and the way that men expect things to happen for them professionally and versus the way women view things? It come up quite a few times in other episodes actually as well, particularly in terms of applying for jobs when you maybe aren't qualified, you don't feel qualified. And quite a few of my guests have talked about it in that context. Do you think it's all part of that same kind of structural problem? And if so, what can leaders do about it?
Well, that's a pretty heavy question. My guess is it is. I try not to think so socially because my work is more helping, it more on the individual or team level. I do see it playing out in teams, and that's one of the things that I really watch for. I have to say more recently in teams, I've been seeing men being much more careful about that. So if they're conscious that it's an issue, I think men that are evolving or evolved, if they're seeing that, right? And if they're successful and their wives or partners are successful, they're maybe more acceptable, not feeling threatened themselves. But that's a really big issue. I think for leaders to, be aware of it and to believe, women, this has been an issue with women in all kinds of ways, right? Even in abuse and, just the biases of women, they're often denied. And for a leader to believe it, I think is a good place to start, is to just, if a woman says, I feel like someone's undermining me, or trying to cut me down to size, listen to that. The problem lies is, as a woman goes up into her career and she gets a new boss, and the boss is, more powerful, then he doesn't listen, then she's in a situation, right? So does that answer that question? Really, that's a pretty big question.
Yeah, it was a deliberately big question. Sorry. Didn't put you on the spot quite that badly. But I think it does. And just from some of the experiences I've had in the workplace, obviously I haven't suffered that because I'm not a woman, but you have seen it. And I remember having arguments with previous bosses about why it might be problematic if, when you need a cup of tea made for a guest, you only ask the nearest woman, you don't consider any other criteria. And getting into an argument like that, and you're like, how do you explain this? Because they're not seeing my logic here when I say this. And I don't understand how I'm supposed to get this point across, because they're not even entertaining that it's problematic. So I think that is the first thing, isn't it? Is take the problem seriously, acknowledge that it is a problem, and have an open conversation about it. And I think, I could apply those same 3 steps to many problems. I'm sure we both could in leadership and the workplace. But I think if you start with those 3 things, you can't go as badly wrong.
I hope you're right. Yes, for sure. It's, I think it's something that at least we have attention to now, right? There's words around it. Tall poppy syndrome, that's becoming a hot topic. So now we have words around it. So hopefully that there will be a consciousness that will help a leader go, oh, okay, maybe that's true. Maybe I shouldn't ask my, executive to get me a cup of coffee.
Yeah. And you mentioned just now as well how it's bad for the bottom line. Tell us a bit more about that. I mean, why is it bad for the bottom line?
The impact on the bottom line is there. And again, I think it's good that we can talk about it in the terms of a bottom line, because it's the bottom line, the negative impact of the bottom line, which is going to enforce leaders to make changes, right? Like, so I think that's actually a good thing. I think we know that a satisfied employee, a happy employee are more productive, right? We know that. So we know that employees that are affected by the tall poppy syndrome, we know that that can lead to all kinds of emotional issues, including stress, reduced motivation, and a lower job satisfaction. And when that happens, people do not work at their full capacity. So that affects the bottom line for sure. What's very interesting, and people are just starting to talk about this, is around, one of the factors that CEOs are looking ahead, and one of their issues is around innovation. I mean, the world is moving at a very fast pace, and organizations need to stay ahead. And well, you cannot be in an innovative state if you're in a state of survival, or you're in the fight or flight mode, right? So that comes from different parts of the brain. So you cannot be bringing your full self to and be creative and imaginative when you're surviving, or protective of yourself. And also, if the environment does not embrace diverse ideas from women, then you're probably missing out on 50% of your employees coming up with some great ideas. So that's a big one. I think the culture can really be affected. It doesn't take long for sort of the culture that, male-dominated, keep women down culture. It gets spread pretty fast. I mean, with social media now, or you're getting a call from a recruiter about a company, and you look on LinkedIn, and you're going to know somebody, right? That's so easy to find out what's going on behind closed doors of an organization. So that damages the reputation of a company too. And then I think there's some more serious risks. In this newer generation, in my experience only, I haven't done any research around this. They will easily put their hand up and say, hey, I'm being abused, or I don't like this. You're stressing me out. There's a lot more talk now around mental health than there's ever been. So I think, it doesn't take long for someone to put their hand up. And there's a legal implication to that, right? And that affects the bottom line. So there's financial risk. So I think there's that. And then we also want to look at an organization that can attract women, because we need that diversity. So it affects the bottom line in lots of ways.
I think you're right. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the other thing about the newer generations, I think they're a lot more likely to just up sticks and go and find another job. It's very rare now that people will stay in the same company for 5-10 years the way they used to. I mean, I even think my parents' generation, I mean, my dad worked for the same company for 40 plus years. That's practically unheard of. Even in my generation, and certainly not in the next one.
Absolutely. And that's an interesting point, because right now they can get another job in a heartbeat, at least in this country. And I'm assuming it's the same where you are, and probably everywhere. Not quite the same. Well, I'll tell you, in the United States, Canada, we're in a talent shortage here. So that doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon. So if you're not happy with what you're doing, you can just go across the street and probably get more money in the process. So, it does really affect the bottom line. And it's amazing how just one or two people with a mindset that, or even one in a team, can affect so many people. Like the halo effect of one person who has something going on for themselves, whether it's, their conscious or unconscious bias, whether it's their jealousy, whether it's their insecurity, whatever, they start treating someone badly, and put them down and, try to cut them down, that affects like this halo effect of toxicity. It's so easy to go from positive to negative than it is from negative to positive. It's a lot easier to go from, it doesn't take much to turn a culture into a negative culture. So we have to work harder to turn it around the other way, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Sadly so. And I guess it's wrapped up in trust, isn't it? And once that's broken, it's very difficult to recover it. And even outside of the company as well, particularly if you put all of these problems next to each other. So people are getting unhappy, they're less productive, and then they're leaving. And then once they've left, I think something else that I've seen changing in the last few years is it used to be if you left a job because you were unhappy, you didn't really talk about it. You didn't talk about why. You didn't want to be kind of tarred with that brush. I don't think that's true anymore. I think people are pretty vocal now about bad companies they've left and why they left them. And so it does damage your reputation a lot more widely than maybe it used to.
I saw, that's interesting because I saw LinkedIn, someone posted it, and she was fairly senior, like maybe even the director level. And she talked very openly about why she was leaving this organization. And in her, the way she described it was, I can't not say anything because I don't want someone else to come into that situation. I'm now being more protective of the next person coming in. That's how she justified it. It's pretty interesting, actually. Like I was like, oh, I hope she doesn't get sued. That was sort of my.
I mean, doing it before you've actually left the place is quite brave, I must say. But while you're still working out your notice, that certainly takes some courage.
Well, you probably the next day got, bring your box in because you're leaving that day.
Well, maybe that's what she was trying to achieve. Who knows? It is. You're right. I mean, I don't know about the legal connotations. I'm not sure how difficult it would be to prove that either way in court. But I think what she was saying there, the example you gave, is right. Particularly if there's a case of some of the sexist issues we've been talking about, or racism, or other kind of safety issues on the job. I think there's a responsibility, isn't there, to warn people? Yeah,
nowadays it's hard to hide, isn't it? I was looking for a new doctor and I just did it by, how many stars they had. Like, it's just hard to, well, he's good, looks like a good doctor, but he's got 3.5 stars. And then you read the comments like, nah, I think I'll keep looking.
Yeah. I guess there's always the chance as well that you have to balance it against is, maybe there were just some bad actors involved and they just decided they didn't like that doctor or that company. And
that's why it's good to check with whoever worked there. Right?
Yeah. I think that's a good idea, particularly if you're applying for a job. Reach out to people who used to work there and ask them a few questions. I think it's easy to do these days on LinkedIn or the internet and at large. And,
Absolutely.
What's the worst that could happen? They say no and don't tell you anything. I think it's certainly worth doing. What would be your 3 strategies then for thriving in that kind of male-dominated industry?
Well, I just want to specify that a male-dominated industry isn't always an industry that's going to cut women down, right? We have to specify, I think. I do a lot of work with women that are in male-dominated industry. One that stands out for me is around architecture or design. They're building big buildings. So they have structural engineers and they have electrical engineers and they have architects and landscape engineers. And definitely the majority of the partners tend to be male. So, when we're looking at coaching these women, I like to take them through a personal branding exercise. And so we think about, what's your personal brand? That's what people say about you when you're not in the room. So having some sort of control over that, like what do you want people to say about you? And how do you go about ensuring that that's what they say? And one of the things you want to do is build a robust personal network, right? That's really important. Be involved in your industry. The more that you can do that, I think it's the better. You're getting someone looking after your back, like watching your back, right? I think that's a good thing to do for sure. And then, that a network can provide sort of a sounding board. They can provide guidance and support. So I think that's important. Yeah. And then, looking at sort of seeking out achievements and, seeking out advancements. I have one client in particular who is really brilliant and working in a very male-dominated industry. And we kind of did a PR on her, right? We did okay, let's just say who's who in your industry that you would like to have that same reputation. What do they do? And it was surprisingly easy how she developed this sort of personal brand, and she got a lot of media attention because as soon as she had something to say, and she was very articulate, smart, yes, they were, the media was all over her, and she was asked to speak at panels and, in panels, and she became someone in the industry that people respected. Well, it was really hard for her organization not to appreciate that because she was bringing attention to the organization too. So I think that's, just having that self-confidence to say, okay, where can I look for opportunities to build this brand of mine? And cultivating relationships internally, I think is critical. Find your tribe. And you want the tribe not to be just women, right? I mean, that's the other thing I think we have to be careful of. You'll see sort of women's groups within organizations, and they're great. I mean, you need that support, but you've got to make sure that your tribe that you're creating, that support structure, has men in it as well. And then, of course, I think one of the things, and we're talking about that a lot because of Tall Poppy, is how do you stay confident and project that confidence? That's a really important part of surviving and thriving in a male-dominated industry. If you're getting kind of packed down, how do you keep that confidence? And so, unfortunately, we have to do work around that, right? It doesn't come naturally for us. When we start getting pecked away at our confidence, we have to really work towards building that self-confidence.
Yes, I think the self-confidence in particular, that's something that a lot of men can struggle with as well. I mean, particularly working, because the other aspect of male-dominated industries, and I know this is a horrible generalization and they're not all like that, but when we use that phrase male-dominated, it evokes that alpha male nonsense sort of culture, doesn't it? The toxic masculinity. And actually that can be very damaging for some men as well. I know I went through quite a lot of confidence issues working in an industry like that. And you mentioned about being pecked down. that happens to nearly everyone with certain types of leaders. And so...
Yeah, the alpha male, competitive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I really hate that. I hate the alpha male thing just as a theory even. It was debunked 30 plus years ago, wasn't it, by the guy who wrote the original theory. Even he said, no, this is wrong. First of all, it was only applied to wolves, and second of all, we only looked at them in captivity, which is totally different how they behave in the wild, and so it doesn't translate really to humanity. Anyway, but that's what I've read. So
but I do see culture. So one that's coming to mind, so I've got to be careful what I say, of course, but it's a very successful private equity, right? And private equity is a very competitive, fast-paced, industry. And some of the private equity firms that I worked with in the past, it's that, male-dominated, not always male-dominated. I shouldn't even say that. It's I don't even know if that's so much around the male-dominated. It's more about the culture of, stepping out in front of other people, like that whole, you have to be extremely successful. You can't just be successful. You have to be extremely driven, extremely, that kind of environment. You know, when you were saying about the confidence issue, what came to mind was about the imposter syndrome. And men struggle with that too, for sure. We think women are the only ones that struggle with that, but men definitely do. I mean, I think just in general, when someone's criticizing you, right, over time, or not recognizing your value, it will eventually affect your self-confidence. And then by the time that you recognize it, it's already affected you. So, you know, before I was a coach, I was an executive search consultant. I had my own agency. And I had estimated that I have interviewed over 10,000 people. Isn't that crazy? Yeah, I did the math on that. I had to keep doing the math because I couldn't believe it. I thought, well, you know, that's probably right. So in those 10,000 people, what struck out that, and this is actually one of the reasons I went into coaching. Yeah, I haven't thought about this in a long time, David. So this is good for me because I'm kind of going back thinking, oh yeah, that's why I felt so driven to go to coaching. Because as I was going through these interviews with very successful people, I would find commonalities, and those that were sort of felt a bit broken to me, definitely edging towards, you know, lack of motivation. Maybe you could even use the word depression. Often told stories of their experience with someone in their organization, sort of criticizing them, never doing enough, or, you know, not appreciating them. And it was that, yeah, actually, that's when I sort of got into the idea of leadership and how I could help people be better leaders and help people that were experiencing their own work experience and how to make that as enjoyable for them. That's sort of my MO, is how to help people be happier at work. But yeah, it's an interesting thing. People are interesting. There's no question about it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, imposter syndrome. Yes, definitely agree with that. I think, I don't know, there's a perception, isn't there, that men are less likely to admit to having challenges like that. And I guess it goes back to this whole alpha male thing, doesn't it? And yeah, I get what you were saying about that as well. And I agree, it is a culture thing. And I guess my problem with it is if you're building a culture based on this idea of alpha male, whatever, that doesn't actually exist even in studies or nature, that's kind of where my issue with it is, really. Do you think men are less likely or less willing, less able to discuss these problems? Or is that just another piece of the problem, that idea, that perception? What do you think?
Well, I think if we think about how, you know, men, you know, how men are sort of the majority in many organizations, right? There's some female-dominated industries too. But I've never once had a male in a female-dominated industry ever say to me, I feel uncomfortable, I'm in this female-dominated industry and they're cutting me down. I've never experienced that. So that's interesting.
Yeah, not at all surprised to hear that, I must say.
You are surprised or aren't surprised?
No, not surprised at all.
No,
sadly.
It's not interesting. Yeah, I'm in a male-dominated industry. Women will have stories. I've never heard that with men, but I do think men experience the imposter syndrome, but just not to the same degree, right? It's like, yeah, I mean, and you know, what's coming to mind was I had lunch, this was probably 15 years ago, with a CEO. And he had been a CEO at another organization, done very well, and been now into his second organization as a CEO. And he ordered wine for lunch. And in those days, we drank wine at lunch. We don't do that anymore because we fall asleep, but we'd have wine at lunch. And I think on his second glass of wine, he leaned over the table and he says, you know, I live every day in fear that I'm going to get caught, that I'm not as good as everyone thinks I am. And I thought, yeah, that's called the imposter syndrome. Let's talk about that. But that was pretty shocking to me that someone even at that level would have that, you know. But if you described him, one of the words you would use to describe him would be humble, right? Where you can't use that word in that many men at the top, really. I mean, now I'm generalizing, but anyway, we digress.
I think you're probably right, though, even if it is a generalization. I mean, thinking back to what I was saying earlier about applying for jobs and things, it's almost like a reverse imposter syndrome sometimes, isn't there, with men being more likely to apply for a job they're not qualified for. And is that an overconfidence thing? Is that a cultural thing? And whereas women, on the whole, will look at a job they're not qualified for and say, well, I'm not qualified, I'll go away and get those qualifications, build up those skills first, and then I'll apply for the job. And I mean, to me, I think that's a big explanation for why there are so many bad managers around, because there's all these people applying for the management roles and not having the qualifications or the knowledge to do it. Isn't always their fault. And so do you think that overconfidence is part of the problem as well? Is it as widespread as we are perhaps led to believe by certain headlines, or is it, what do you think?
I'm really not sure. I mean, I'm a woman, so that's one thing. I mean, I can only speak for sort of, my own experience. I'm really not sure. I mean, I think we're looking at, like, if a man is 35 and going to his, applying for something he's really not qualified to apply, we have to look at, someone who was born in somewhere in the 80s or, late 80s or beyond, and think about that experience and how he's been and where he was in his family. And, I kind of think back of, like, when I've studied quite a bit of psychotherapy and or psychoanalysis, and Sigmund Freud's, he had so much confidence and what his ideas and confidence and projected them. Well, his mother adored him. He was like this, we really are digressing now. But I mean, it's like, where's, that sort of, where did that come from, right? It's like that experience from the time they're young, right? So I think it's complex, right? It's complex.
Yeah, I guess it's difficult to really know, isn't it, how widespread that phenomena actually is. And then if it is as widespread as maybe we think it is the part of the cause for that, is that a structural thing with the way that businesses work and the way capitalist organizations push people into career progression paths that maybe if they want more money, they have to go for it, even if they don't necessarily want to do it. And you make it about that as the motivator rather than wanting to be actually managing people or wanting to do that next job up. And yeah, there's a whole load of stuff tied up in it. And it actually leads really nicely into the next question, which I'm also very interested to hear through the lens of your experience as a recruiter. And that is, what can we actually do to attract the right team members and make our recruitment processes work? Because if we're getting people who are either quite well qualified and could do a really good job, but don't think they could and therefore don't apply, or we're getting people who are not at all qualified for it but are applying anyway because they want the job, well, what can we do about it?
Well, the recruitment process has, many parts to that, right? Many parts to that for organizations that are doing it well. I'm a big fan of assessments, and full disclosure, I'm a partner for Predictive Index, so full disclosure there. But I do, okay. I'm a fan of assessments. I use Illumina, which is a wonderful tool. It came out of Scotland, actually, and I love that for working with teams or doing coaching. I think we can get a lot of information from assessments. We have to take them as a tool, right? They are a tool. They're not the be all end all. But for Predictive Index, it looks at the behavioral traits and the work styles. And it can really help match the candidate to the roles that they're most likely to excel in. If an organization values like high drive, for example, they really value, people that are purposeful and maybe conflict diverse. And then there's two things. One is they will try to build teams. We always hire people like ourselves, right? So that's one thing, but then you're going to get a culture of that, right? Or if you are very, let's say, collaborative, adaptable, and, empathetic, that kind of personality, you're going to hire people similar. But look at how those two are opposite, right? So if we are trying to create a team, let's say, or a culture that has more of the human element, people focused as opposed to outcome focused, then how do we know that in an interview? So by doing an assessment like predictive index, it gives us like sort of the baseline of what kind of drivers these people have. So what are their needs? Because when we look at someone's drives, we know that we can then assess needs that will keep them motivated. And also it's like helping them in the interview process, because then it's like, oh, okay, so I see that, you're highly outcome focused. You're very, driven. Tell me about a time you've been collaborative. What was that like for you? Like, ask really specific questions. And actually, Predictive Index gives you some questions to probe on. And we think about people's strengths and weaknesses too. Everyone comes to every interview, every job with their strengths and their gaps. And, Carl Jung says a weakness is an overused strength. So that's an interesting concept if you're interviewing, right? See, you're very, assertive. You speak your mind. Do you ever get to the point of being aggressive or, that kind of thing? So I think it's really, I wouldn't hire anyone myself without doing an assessment. A predictive index really can give us a lot of information, and they're not the only one out there. That's for sure. I think they started, after World War II. So they've been around probably the longest or close to the longest, but so they've got a lot of data and always updating. So I just feel like it gives people sort of a clear sense. And the other thing too is that if they do it in the initial stages, it can reduce bias, right? You're looking at, okay, this is what I'm looking for in this person, like this role. So, and you can get people to feed into that. So you can create, okay, this is what I'm looking for in this role. And then so you don't know whether you don't know anything about them, and you see, oh, that's really off, or that's close. Okay, let's take a good look at that. I think that's another thing too, is to not bring that bias into the initial stages of recruitment. It's good for the organization. Promotes fair and consistent evaluation of candidates, right? Leading to more diverse and inclusive workplaces.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's quite a lot of things in there that you said are very interesting. First of all, the concept of assessment. So I've had a similar conversation as this with quite a few people in more the tech industry and from like the development side, and mostly those managers, those leaders are adamant that they hate the testing approach. They also don't like the interviewing approach. And so like, okay, well, how do you do it then? I don't. And you can, so one example that sticks in my mind is the guy I was talking to. He said, you can put a potential developer through as many technical tests as you like, and they might ace all of them, but that doesn't tell me what they're going to be like as an employee, as a person in the office, as someone that I've got to work with. And then you can actually say the same about an interviewing process as well, because nobody is at their best in an interview. Everyone's always going to be stressed. They're always going to be nervous. They're always going to be more likely to give you the answer they think you want to hear rather than the answer that actually tells you anything about them as a person. And so I just find it really interesting because there's this whole way of doing it that's been accepted for decades and decades, and yet most people acknowledge that it doesn't really work very well. And so what else can we do? Like, what's the answer? I don't know. No one I've spoken to really knows. I mean, I think your answer is good. I do. But I think, again, for me, it's about the personality as much as the skill set. I mean, skills can be taught, can't they? And I don't know how much of that comes through from a test of that type. I don't know. You tell me.
Well, I think you look at behavior, right? You look at what have you done in the past? Could they do that in the future? And, I mean, now, as we were talking earlier about, it's hard to hide, right? So being able to reference check properly and things like that. I mean, there's no guarantee, but it's pretty expensive when you make a bad hire. That's for sure. Estimates up to 3.5 times. I've seen it as high as 3.5 times the annual salary. And it could be worse if they, they're in a position where whatever they're doing is causing even more issues. There was something here. What was it? Just recently, where it was one person made a mistake and caused a major issue. I think it was with our water system. And they said it was one person that had done something, didn't check something, and we had to boil our water in Austin, Texas. Like, crazy. Yeah, we did. It was for a few days, and then it's like something like one person had made that mistake. Yeah, it's really, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the old spilled the coffee on the computer problem, isn't it?
Right. So, was that in skill? I mean, skill is definitely important there, but it's also what kind of person would be like that careful, that precise, like you'd want to know, like the conscientious, what we call it conscientious, where you might not need that if you're looking for someone who's, an inspiring person that's going to be building teams. And
it's very difficult. I mean, there's no easy answer, is there?
No.
People make mistakes. There's no getting around that. You can't expect perfect performance ever, really, let alone all the time. And I've heard similar statistics as well about the cost of a bad hire. I do wonder at what point that cost kicks in. Like, if you realise quite quickly that they're the wrong person and you act quickly to do something about that, do you still incur that cost, or is it if you wait 6 months and don't do anything about it, is that the point the 350% kicks in? I'd like to know that.
Yeah, exactly. And then I guess it also depends on if what damage they can do in a short period of time too. But when you were talking about the interviewing and people being nervous and not necessarily on their game, I laugh because there was always the question. What was the question? It was like, everyone's got some weaknesses. Tell me one thing that is your weakness. And I'll tell you, I mean, the common answer was, well, I've been told that I just work too hard, and or I'm just too dedicated, or I'm too precise, or it's like, yeah,
I'm too perfect.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway.
Yeah, it's probably, and then there's the off the wall questions as well. If you're a flavour of ice cream, what flavour would you be? That kind of silly ones.
Yeah, they call those the Barbara Walters questions. Right?
Yeah.
What kind of animal would you be? Yeah.
Yeah.
How can I help you know if that's the person that's going to fit the culture, build a team, whatever.
I know. That's my least favourite question that I've been asked in interviews in the past, and it used to come out quite a lot, is obviously dates the time that I was interviewing, but was, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I really hated that question, because it's like, well, I don't know. It depends how well this interview goes, really, doesn't it? Like, what are you looking for me to say? I want your job? Is that what you want me to say?
Back then in the day, one sitting in your chair 5 years. I know, it's funny. Those questions are funny, aren't they? Because we know how people want you to answer. You're not going to get it. I mean, some of these questions are really obvious, right?
Yes. Maybe the lesson then is avoid the formulaic question that everyone asks and try and ask something that's actually relevant or different, at least.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. What would you say has been your own best experience of being led?
Oh, wow. I've been working for myself now. I've been self-employed probably well over 25 years, I think. Probably about 25 years or more. So I had to go back. I have to think back in my brain for that one. That's a hard one. I think for me, it's more like I'm thinking of like little bits and pieces of different people that have had managed me. But I think that the best managers that I ever had or leaders that I ever had were people that created an environment that you wanted to be in. So it was really about, let's know each other. Let's get to, like, that was really important for them. And cared about you. Right? Before I went to work on my own, the company I worked for before that, the gentleman who owned the business, his office was in a very common corridor, so you'd often pass his. He never came out and said, "Open door anytime." And it was his organization. He's the CEO of this company, but there was that. His door was always open, and he was just very welcoming. If you walked into his office, he'd be very welcoming. Like it was like he was creating this sort of. I'd hate to use the word family because it's not true, but just a comfortable environment and cared about you. I remember at Christmas one day, I was walking by and he was walking into his office. So we're in the hallway together. And he says, "How's it going?" And I said, "Oh, I just got a call. My kids are alone at home." They were, old enough. And my daughter called to tell me that my son was looking under the beds for the Christmas presents and things like that. And I remember having this conversation and he goes, "Oh, put him in the trunk of the car." And just, sort of that I'm the same as you and I care about you as a person. And, then the next day he came up and goes, "So did they find them?" Like just that sort of caring about a human being. And I was adding a lot of value to the organization. And he let me know he appreciated that. He would say, like, when I'd get when something great would happen, and it was a big company, but I think that's great. And then I consulted for a really interesting organization, and it's guy Glenn Chilton, actually. And he used to love to walk around and just talk about people and talk to people. And when you'd bring somebody up, he knew their story. Like, I thought that was really amazing. Like, he really cared about people. He wanted to put his office like right in the middle, but it didn't, the footprint of the office didn't allow for that. But he wanted to be close to people. Like, I think that's it. He's just really caring.
Interesting story. It makes me wonder where you stand on offices and their layout. So we won't get into the hybrid and remote argument. It's not an argument, is it? It's a conversation. Because I think I've done that to death anyway, apart from anything else. But so, what about open office versus cubicles versus managers have their own office with a closing door and that kind of thing? What do you think works best?
Well, I think it depends on the organization and what they're doing, right? But I think it's important for there to be enough offices with doors. Because really, if you're going to be developing someone, you don't want to be doing that and having other people over here, and you don't want to be in a situation where, behind a closed door means something bad.
I think you're right. There's conversations where you want to have them behind closed doors for protecting people's privacy, apart from anything else. But then also, I think the office, as in an office with a door with your name on it, and that becomes a sort of status symbol. And I think it's very easy then to do the opposite of the example you've given with your former manager, and close yourself off from people and use that as a barrier and avoid having to interact. And I think there's a certain culture, isn't there, that develops from that. But then equally, I've also worked in open plan offices where they were the least productive environments possible.
Exactly. I mean, if you are, in an area where people need to share information, like maybe in IT, and they're quiet workers anyway, right? They're used to focusing. They can focus. They're quiet. They're internal processors, as opposed to someone like me who needs to chat it out. I'm not the ideal person to work in an open office because my ideas come when I speak. I'm an external processor, or someone who's internal. Like a lot of again, generalizations are never good, but they say generalizations are always wrong. But being in an environment where there's a lot of IT and they need to share, that works well. That can work really well. Right? I know in one office I was consulting and we changed up. We had to change up the furniture, and we bought a bunch of furniture that was pretty new, secondhand. So it wasn't like we got to choose, right? And it was so reasonably priced, and the organization needed that kind of break. But they were low. The cubicles were low, and they hated it, right? People need a little bit of privacy, right? So they need a little bit of privacy.
Yeah, I agree. It depends on the organisation, doesn't it? And even like the individual teams within it. I think, I mentioned hybrid earlier, but I think a true hybrid would be where you've got all of these options available, and because some people will feel differently on different days. Like one day I might want to go and be in that team environment and be able to bounce ideas around. Another day you might want to just be left alone. I've got to concentrate and get my work done. So I guess the ideal, if you're fortunate enough to have the space and the money to do it, is have like these little pockets dotted around the office of different zones, if you like. But I'm probably getting a bit too overexcited about that idea, aren't I? So
I know. And then there was I remember Virgin in Toronto, Virgin Mobile. When they were in Toronto, I remember they were one of the first offices where nobody had an office. And I was recruiting one of their senior people out of there. And that was one of the reasons she was leaving. She said, I feel like I can't really do my job. I'm like, it was just really hard. So I think it depends on the organization too. It's a crazy place right now with this kind of hybrid, some are in, some are out,
Yes, I think it'll level itself out eventually.
Well, I know in Austin, they're still building tons of office space, so we'll see where that ends up.
Yeah, I could go into the conspiracy theories about large construction firms lobbying governments and rule setting, but I won't. I've just done it anyway. But
very subtle.
So, what do you think is the biggest mistake that you've seen a leader make then?
Without a doubt, not being able to self-manage. Not being self-aware and not being able to self-manage. They're the foundations of emotional intelligence. That's absolutely the foundation. And shameless plug. That's why I started my leadership training course with self-management, self-awareness, because, when we think about sort of the self-management piece, some people are fine. They're absolutely fine in sort of a stressful, working with someone moody or that can show anger. But probably about 50% of people aren't. They're not. And employees, people, we need consistency. That provides us with some psychological safety. The behaviors that leaders need to demonstrate to foster psychological safety in teams does not include being up and down, moody, showing anger, not being in control of themselves. It makes people feel very nervous and they can't count on them. And I think that's the biggest one, really. And that comes from, you have to be self-aware in order to self-manage, right? You have to know how you are. when you're overextended, for example. You have to know how your behavior impacts others. So it's a big one.
The thing with stress is, even if you can manage it to an extent, everyone's different and it's cumulative as well. And so you might be okay for a day or a week or a month, but if you do it for a year, everyone at some point will snap. And so you've got to be able to recognize those signs, haven't you? And then manage that and, do what's appropriate, whether that be, I'm taking a mental health day or something so I don't blow up at the office and and negatively affect the team.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's why we have cognitive behavioral therapy, right? We can change this. Once it's identified in an organization, it needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
People need to have tools. If you cannot control your stress level, your overextension, and you have a mercurial change in personality, doesn't mean you're a bad worker, bad person, but you need to get a grip. That's why, and we know there's tools. We know there's all kinds of different ways of approaching that, but don't ignore it. Family life will be better too, because right? It's no doubt if you behave a certain way at work, you're probably behaving that way at home. You need to get a grip on that.
Yeah, and I think it's doubly important for leaders, isn't it? Because they've got to worry about it not just from themselves and their own behaviour, but the impact it has on their people, but also whether their people are having similar struggles and whether they, as a leader, giving them access to those same tools and so on. Mm-hmm. And it just becomes a vicious cycle otherwise, doesn't it?
Well, that's a really good way to look at it too, because it's like if I lose it and or I become moody or whatever, I'm giving permission for my team to do the same thing. And we need to, leaders need to model the behavior that they expect from their team.
Which reminds me actually of one of my favorite definitions of culture in an organization, which is that your culture is the worst behavior that you allow to continue. When you think about that in the context of things like bullying and what we were talking about earlier with kind of male toxic masculinity and all of that. So the worst thing that you allow happen, you're saying that's fine and anyone can do it. And so what lesson does that give to people? What example is that setting? What are you creating as a culture? Anyway, stepping off my soapbox.
It's funny.
Leadership Heroes.
Okay, I'm going to skip ahead to the final question, which is also my favourite question, because I'm conscious that I've taken up a lot of your time and I don't want to be too greedy. So this question is the only one that I ask every single guest without modification, and I call it Leadership Heroes. So the question is, if you had to pick one person, they can be alive or dead, past, present, real or fictitious, who in your opinion would perfectly embody leadership, who would that be and why? And yes, I know no person is perfect, but it's a hypothetical. So.
Well, it's easy for me. It was Alan Mulally. Do you know that name, Alan Mulally? So Alan Mulally was the CEO of Boeing and turned Boeing around after 9/11, and then was tapped to be the CEO of Ford. And when he came in, it was bleeding. They were losing billions a year with a B, and he turned the organization around and made it the most profitable it's been in over a decade. And I saw him speak at a conference, and just his whole mindset around people was just amazing to me. So I'm such a fan of him. I love to look at, when he goes and talks to Stanford graduate school or whatever. I love to see his, on YouTube, his talks. He's just I'd love to meet him face to face. I've seen him up on a stage. It's not quite the same. I'd love to meet him face to face. He's just I think, amazing person. And this is the way he's running his life too. He has several children, and he told a story about how Sunday mornings the family did their laundry together and folded their linen. A whole house full of things. He's got several kids. I don't know, 4 or 6 or whatever. And just being able to be very thoughtful and intentional in his world. So that story I thought was really lovely because it was like being intentional. But he turned around Ford by this one team vision, and he getting people to work together across the whole company's, vast global ecosystem, 140 he called it. And he set this simple goal for the company. He wanted a company that, was viable and profitable and growth for all. Just this whole, attitude of being able to create this and thinking about people. He talked about how many thousands of people, or 100,000 of people worldwide how Ford affected their lives, these employees. And he came up with this great expression. I love this. He's like, putting people first means that you love them up. And I've used this with my clients a lot, actually, because I'm a bit of a copycat. So I just love this. So his whole mindset around loving them up. I mean, what CEO, have you ever heard that? Anything even close to that from any CEO? Just love them up. And he shared a story on stage about being in an executive meeting, and one of the executives was not following the rules of engagement properly. And he didn't say anything in the meeting, but he went up to him afterwards and he basically said, here's the way we've agreed to behave with one another, and you aren't. So listen, love you. This isn't the place for you. You go. Wish you well. We'll help you. If you're going to stay here, you got to abide by these rules. But he did it in a loving way. I mean, I find it amazing. I find that he's got this incredible drive that he turned this massive ship around to being profitable, at the same time cared about the people. It's amazing to me. And he explains, like, to him, leadership takes courage, right? It's about, you have to have a point of view about the future and be courageous. And I thought, I just love that.
Yeah. I was going to say the optimist in me would like to believe that the one isn't possible without the other. If you don't look after the people, the big ship doesn't turn, the profits don't come. I think that's definitely true in very small businesses, because the people are the business, and it's literal at that kind of scale. I don't know about the big corporates though. That's so far outside of my experience. I don't know. From the outside looking in, it feels like it's just a massive machine and there's lots of tiny, tiny little cogs in there. But then, I don't know. Clearly it worked. So
really worked. And yeah. I think it's interesting that, at the leadership team or executive team, the behavior had to be modeled right there. And that he was willing to, stand up for what he believed was important, and he would have let that person go. In fact, I think that he did go. I think he did that. I think that he did leave. So I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, and it's such a great example of how best to do it, and especially within the context of probably the most difficult circumstances that industry has faced. Thinking about Boeing anyway, post 9/11, like since the invention of flight, probably. What a great example. Thank you for sharing.
My pleasure.
Awesome. Well, I've run out of questions. The only other thing that I give every guest the opportunity to do at the end is if you'd like to point the listeners towards your website, or if you have your own podcast or a book that they might want to read, please feel free to do so.
Well, that's really sweet. Yes, my website is Elevate Organizations with a Z, or a Z as we say in Canada.
And in the UK, yep.
It's elevateorganizations.com. I do have a book coming out in November. It's Overachieving Women, and some strategies to help overachieving women succeed in life and in work. So I appreciate you letting me get a plug in for that one. And that's actually how my courses started. It was like I was going to do a course to go with the book, and then the next thing I'm doing a leadership course. So that's how we are.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned about overachieving, so there you go. It's
takes one to know one is one of my clients.
Yeah. I'm going to say you're walking the talk, aren't you? There you go.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, it's been lovely chatting with you. Thank you again for getting up so early for it. Much appreciated.
All right. Well, it's been my pleasure.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Barbara, for taking the time today. Really do appreciate the early start there, and I hope we didn't interrupt your breakfast. Listeners, if you would like to learn more about Elevate Organizations and Barbara and what she does, I've put the website link in the episode description, so you can find that and go and visit the website. And for those of you who found me on LinkedIn, as soon as I get more information about Barbara's imminent book release later this year, I'll post it on there, I'm sure, so you can find that out when the time comes. If you'd like to learn more about Leading with Integrity and the leadership courses, programs, and services that I offer, again, there is a website address in the episode description, but it is www.leadernotaboss.co.uk/sign up. Thank you, listeners, for joining us today. I hope that you'll be back again next week. And in the meantime, remember, as always, be a leader, not a boss.